My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here at Duck Pond with Julia Cattrall. It's June 11th, 2021. Julia, thanks so much for joining us today. First question to get you started is why wine?
Well, I sort of had a little bit of a head start in my journey into the wine industry. I was raised on a small organic vineyard that was planted by my father in 1973. So I spent a lot of my childhood out there with a hand hoe, pulling leaves, raising catch wires, and just generally sort of doing all of the sort of unglamorous work of the vineyard. And I think like a lot of farm kids, my parents had big ambitions for me to do lots of other things in the world. I think my mom especially always saw me as a college professor or something far, far away, and that I might eventually retire to the farm. And I loved being there, and I went to Reed College to study anthropology, really with just a passion for this subject and not much of an idea of what to do with it. And I think I thought, well, I'll go to graduate school. And by the time I finished my undergrad, I was just ready to never sit in a chair again. And so I had a couple of trips planned, one to South America and one to the Grand Canyon, and they happened to bookend harvest perfectly just by happenstance. And Tad Seastead, the proprietor of Ransom, who we were selling grapes to, said, oh, if you're free for October and the first half of November, you should really come and work a wine harvest, make some money for your travels, and and then you can go to graduate school. So I worked a wine harvest. Really liked it. Still didn't feel ready to go to graduate school. Went back to Portland, worked, some sort of odd jobs, and suddenly it was harvest season again. And so I thought, I'll work one more harvest. And by the second one, I think I had enough of an understanding of what was going on, how dynamic the community was, how much passion there was, and how much opportunity there was to have a career that really kind of enveloped the sciences and manual labor, and this really complete sensory experience. And so I thought, well, maybe actually this is something that I should pursue. And as it happened, the previous assistant winemaker had gone on to work on his own project, and so I was able to transition into a full-time role between Ransom and Lumos, who are sharing space in a small winery space in McMinnville. And I just kind of hit the ground running and did everything from, general labor there and, was trying to kind of learn on the side. Always thought that maybe I would go back and get a master's in viticulture and enology, but at some point realized that I kind of had the roles that I would be hoping to transition into following that graduate work. And so I just kept, reading articles and, trying to learn everything that I could while working in those roles. And I guess in some ways I'm a real outlier in that I have effectively the same job that I started with, although it's gone through a number of permutations. I guess it's been basically 15 years later. I'm still the winemaker for Ransom and Lumos, so I've worked up from harvest intern to winemaker, and along the way have worked a few other places, including Dimnio 4 and a harvest season at Escarpment in New Zealand. But effectively, I've really sunk my teeth into what I'm doing and really evolved along with the role.
So you mentioned obviously growing up in the industry, or at least in the vineyard part of the industry. What was your perspective? What were the first kind of memories you have of wine outside of sort of the family farm? What did it mean to you when you were growing up?
So actually, ironically, my very first memory is of wine. My first memory is just before my first birthday, in my dad's arms at Myron Redford's summer solstice party. It's one of those memories that you can date because the summer solstice is the same day every year. And seeing all of these people kind of happy and dancing and eating and drinking and and really sort of like reveling. And I guess that felt a little bit more. I think my family growing up perhaps wasn't quite as involved in the social scene of the wine world, as perhaps I have come to be. They're pretty focused and, and definitely kind of more morning folks who get up and get out into the vineyard. But it is ironic that my first memory is of that gathering. And I think it was interesting growing up in one of the small communities that, I would say at that time and still to this day is not quite as engaged in the wine industry. I went to Amity schools. I did transfer to McMinnville for high school just to be able to take a few additional AP classes. But my peers growing up, nobody else was involved in wine in any way really. And there's definitely a sense that that wine was fancy people who were from elsewhere. And I think that was like a real challenge to conceptualize my place. My family farm has been, in the family and been farmed by my family since 1917. So it's a century farm. My family has really deep roots in the community and on our land. But I think growing up, I did in some ways still feel like a little bit of an outsider because of our connection to this wine community, that I think even though my family was farming in the Amity area and all of my childhood friends' families were also farming in the Amity area, there was a sense of this sort of real differentiation between farming wine grapes and farming grass seed or, any of the other commodity crops. And it's something that I feel really keenly aware of, I think, maybe in a different way than a lot of people. And it's definitely something that I'd love to see more work on by the industry going forward. I think drawing connections with the broader agricultural community, is not just sort of good manners. It's also, I think, good business. And I think it's something that, that we don't do enough of. And ultimately, I think agricultural diversity is really important, and especially up in the hills, perhaps under threat in some ways.
So you mentioned kind of going to school without really any kind of clear intention of what you were going to do with school. I'm curious, at what point did wine become something that was realistic? Was it only after school? Did you think about it growing up at all? Did you think about it in high school or college that you might get into wine or farming?
I think by the time I was in college, I wrote my my undergraduate thesis at Reed on the Appellation Contrôlée system in Burgundy and sort of how it reified and just sort of like renegotiated cultural normativity in these rural communities, where it was applied. And I think by that point I had a sense that potentially this would be a way forward for me in some way. Maybe not a clear sense, and certainly if I had had a clear sense sooner, I think it would have made sense to do the undergrad program at Oregon State or at Davis. But I think, I always felt a really deep connection to our, place, and always felt kind of like profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of transitioning to being somebody who was living in an urban environment or being far away. I mean, it always felt really wrong, and I think it was always something that was kind of in conflict. And I think I didn't have a clear understanding, and quite frankly, I think the industry has really matured a lot, and there are more clear opportunities for young professionals than there were when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I don't think that you had the sense that you could come out of college and get a job as a cellar hand that would be full-time and with benefits and work your way up through. It didn't feel accessible, I guess, in the same way that I hope it does now. And it's something that I think is a tremendous benefit of the wine studies program at Linfield, is to have something in the community that creates some of those bridges. And I hope that continues to sort of make the wine industry feel like a possibility for folks growing up around here, because I do think that it is the sort of undergirding of a lot of the sort of best professional opportunities in the region. And I think growing up here, it didn't feel, even as somebody who was connected to it, it didn't really feel accessible to me, and I am certain that it didn't feel accessible to any of my peers, some of whom do now work in the wine industry. But it felt like a million miles away, even though it was right in our midst.
Interesting perspective. I appreciate that. You talked about your thesis. I'm curious, where did that idea come from?
Well, I mean, I think like so many young academics, was sort of at the mercy of my advisor, who I had already selected. And I had this idea that I wanted to look at something locally because I really wanted to be able to do some ethnographic work, which was not necessarily encouraged by the Reed College anthropology department. The idea was always that you were going to get a PhD in anthropology, so you might as well do a research-based undergrad thesis, because then you could go and do this like big ethnographic piece for your doctorate. You're nodding as if you have heard this all before. But so
same idea, different school.
Totally, yeah. So Paul Silverstein was my advisor, and he's tremendous, and I really enjoy him. He's incredibly passionate, and his primary fields were France and North Africa. And North Africa, while tremendously fascinating, I did a lot of coursework in it, wasn't really, a focus of passion for me. And so I kind of went to him with this idea that I wanted to talk about land use planning in rural areas in Oregon, which was something, growing up in an area that felt very rural and kind of felt like McMansionville as I was coming of age. I was really alarmed by not just the scale of the development, but also the tone of the development. The idea that it wasn't, someone has taken this basically vacant parcel and developed it into, a small homestead or a small vineyard or a small orchard, but somebody has basically developed it into an enormous lawn with a huge house in the middle of it. Felt profoundly uncomfortable, and frankly, like an affront to the way of life that, that I had enjoyed growing up. And so that was kind of like where I really wanted to focus my energy. And he, was kind of like, it seems like maybe you're a little close to the subject, and your ability to sort of produce something with any sense of academic objectivity is pretty compromised on this, which he was completely right, if you can't tell. And also, what kind of source material are you going to be looking at in terms of the text? There isn't a lot. What if you did something that was sort of tangentially related to what you are looking at in a place where you have a little bit more critical distance, and also where there is really interesting sort of like legal textual work that you can fall back on. What if you looked at this in Burgundy, which I think has similar challenges, and the challenges maybe have been going on for a lot longer, and they have had this, this approach of codifying a lot of their agricultural practices in a way that also codifies land use. It might be an interesting way to, get a better look at your subject in a way that maybe is a little bit more productive. And I think that was great advice. I learned a lot doing that thesis, not nearly as much as I would if I was potentially doing it now and not as a, burned out 22-year-old who was ready to never be in a library again. But I think it dovetailed really well with my sort of burgeoning interest in wine. It was a great excuse for me to spend money I didn't have on drinking wines from Burgundy, especially, for my, qualifying exam. It was definitely one of those things where it's like, okay, great, now I have to buy some Burgundies, because if I don't, then they probably won't pass me because I should have done a better job and I should have worked harder. But I definitely learned a lot. And equally as importantly, now when people say, oh, did you get your degree in wine? I can say, well, I got my degree in anthropology, which is, the study of asking critical thinking questions about, human culture, which I think is incredibly relevant. And also, I wrote my thesis on Appellation Contrôlée in rural France, which, satisfies anyone who feels that anthropology isn't sufficiently relevant to my professional life. But it's a joke that I tell all the time, and I think it's really true beyond my own experience, that I got the alternative viticulture and enology degree for Oregon, which is a completely esoteric degree in a liberal art that makes you say, what on earth am I going to do with my degree? I think there are tons of winemakers who have philosophy degrees or European history degrees. And yeah, I mean, you laugh because I know that you're counting in your head, you've interviewed so many of them, right? But I think ultimately it's the thing that is perhaps the most precious about the wine industry, besides being connected to, the world that we live in, is this sense of a community of people who are incredibly passionate about what they're doing and just whatever idea is in front of them. And I think that a lot of times those people tend to major in something really impractical in college. And then they end up here.
The majors that make your parents cringe.
Exactly, yes. I think my mother did cringe, but.
So you mentioned first harvest is just kind of a happy coincidence, coincidental timing. Tell me about your sort of memories of first harvest. What was it like? What was the work like, and what was it about it that appealed to you?
Well, it was 2007, so it rained a lot. I think my first day coincided with the beginning of the really heavy rains, and I think it was, Tad had said, okay, you'll work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And the first day, I think I had the flu actually. So I showed up to work with a fever of 103. I cleaned the press in the rain for about 8 hours. And then he said, you should go home. I was like, no, you said we're working 12 hours. I'm here for it. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna work for 12 hours. He's like, there's going to be plenty of time for that. Go home and get some sleep. And I'm glad I did, because you know how it is when you get a cold or the flu during harvest, it just drags on. So, it rained, I was sick, we worked many days in a row. It was not 6 days a week, it was 8 days a week. But I think, a lot of our cellar hand, Aaron, his first harvest was this last year with the fires. And I do think having a really challenging vintage as your first vintage sets you up really well with reasonable expectations for harvest going forward. And I think I kind of went into it with this perspective of, I know I can work hard, but the kind of hours that they're talking about seem crazy. Like, people can't really do that, right? And I think there is a tremendous satisfaction with really, realizing what you're capable of, and really just kind of like making the most of an incredibly difficult situation. And it was fun. There was camaraderie. We had a house nearby that was Tad's house, and so we'd work all day and then go have a long dinner and drink some cool wines and then come back and work some more. And I think that sense of camaraderie and work was something that I hadn't necessarily really had in that way before, and I found that tremendously fulfilling as well.
Tell me about Tad as kind of a first wine mentor boss. Well, what was he like? What did you learn from him, and what was the kind of atmosphere like around him and his work?
So I think it's great to have had Tad and Di together, because I think they have really different styles of management and personality types. And I think Tad is somebody he is super passionate. He has this real sense of right and wrong and the way to do things and black and white, and and he cares really deeply about his people and what he's doing. And I think he also really wants to be like right there in whatever it is, and I think sometimes as we've worked together over the years, I think especially as I got more experience, it can become a challenging thing where it's like, no, now I have a really strong sense of how I think that it ought to be done. But I think, to have somebody like that as kind of your first boss is really good, because I think you set this really strong tone of how things should be done, and there are really clear expectations. And I think there's that picture of the boss like pulling from the front instead of like pushing from the back, and I think both Tad and I, who are both kind of like early mentors, are absolutely great examples of that. The sense of there's a lot to do, but we're going to be right there in it. And it's definitely something that I'm trying to incorporate into my own leadership style, that the harder the work is, like the more present I want to be, which is a challenge sometimes, as a winemaker, because you have so much paperwork and work orders, and I think it's a challenge sometimes to get back out into the throw of it. But I think that was something that Tad did a really good job prioritizing, is making sure that setting aside all of that stuff and being on the floor during harvest and making sure that there was a sense that we were really doing it together.
And you mentioned, of course, Di, Lumos, Tell me about him and sort of what you learned from him, and as you kind of went off to your own leadership role, what did you bring from both of them? Besides, I mean, you mentioned a little bit earlier, but what else did you bring from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Di is, I would say, probably the most confident delegator, and sort of, he has this really expansive view of what the team can accomplish that I think is really, he doesn't center himself in that. He has a really strong sense of what people are capable of, and I think he's really good at setting his own ego aside and saying, no, like, you can do that. You are great. You are doing a great job. Like, I am going to make sure that you feel empowered to do that on your own. And, I think it's the reason that he is able to wear so many hats so effectively, because he has the ability to set things in the hands of the people, and it's not like, I'm checking out and I'm going to go do something else. He's still very present, but I think he does a really good job figuring out who is right for the role at hand and making sure that they have the tools they need to do it, and then making sure that they're empowered to do it, and then like truly delegating entire tasks. And I think that's something that I have tried really hard to incorporate into my own leadership style. This idea that, obviously on your first day of your first harvest, you can't say, okay, your task is to make this entire wine. Maybe the first task is clean this entire fermenter on your own, or do this entire pump over on your own. But I think in management, it's really easy to give somebody part of a task, give them the easier part, and then give a more experienced person the harder part, and pair people together in ways that aren't necessarily ideally suited for everyone's kind of job satisfaction and learning. And I really try to think of tasks as discrete units, in whatever way that means, and give people a task that is salient in and of itself. And obviously as people grow in their roles, you can kind of build on that, where maybe the first task is do this entire pump over yourself, and then maybe a couple of years on it's, hey, like, why don't you sort of be the person who is always kind of like managing the fermentation curve on this and really checking in with it. But I think that that's definitely something I feel like I learned from Di, is being really intentional about the ways in which you delegate so that you can really help people grow. And I think maybe from the combination of the two of them, there is this idea I have about the rule of 10%, that if you are giving feedback, it's really important to be intentional about the kind of like ratio of positive to critical feedback. And so what I try to do, and I don't know, maybe you'll interview some of the people who work for me someday, they'll be like, no, she was terrible. What I try and do is, if somebody is doing something that's negative 40% of the time and something that seems like they're on the right track 60% of the time, I try and give 70% positive feedback. So you always, feel, because I think people hear things that are critical a lot more than they hear things that are positive. And I think, trying to be intentional about, not just washing over all of the things that are problematic, but making sure that people really hear the things, that they're doing well and getting better. And that's something that, it's hard to know exactly how you're doing and stuff like that, but it's something that I feel like I really, divined from those two.
People keep showing up for work the next day, it's usually a pretty good sign.
They keep showing up, yeah, exactly,
So you mentioned something in that answer that it begs a question. You talked about kind of, you start harvest, you don't really know anything about anything, and so you're given tasks that are possibly not the most enjoyable tasks. So tell me, what keeps you coming back, especially for you? What kept you coming back even when your job was like cleaning stuff in the rain?
I mean, I think there is something so affirming about the sense of kind of real purpose that you have. You have literally like mountains of fruit. Sometimes the mountains that stack up here are pretty daunting, quite frankly. And you're turning it into something else. I mean, I think there's this tremendous, every job has a purpose and gives you a sense of purpose if you're thinking about it the right way. But there's something so tangible and inabstract about what we do during harvest, and And I was looking through a set of production records for a wine for a compliance thing, and the set of production records, so like one production record would be like, added, 25 grams per hectoliter of yeast nutrient to this tank. And this production record for this one wine was 64 pages long, single spaced. And that makes me tired just thinking about it. But also, I think it's this thing, you can work by yourself all day and you get a certain amount done. And when you work on a team and everybody's really dialed in, just the amount that you can get done and the sense of flow and camaraderie, I think is really tremendous. And, I think I'm a pretty extroverted person, and there's just something great about feeling like you are in this network of people, and often people who are coming from all over the country who each have, really distinct stories and a lot of different stuff to offer, and figuring out, what it is that they're good at, how to help them realize their potential, and, and really just kind of build something out of what you've got. Yeah, I still think harvest is a lot of fun most years, I mean, last year between the pandemic and the fires, I think, felt a little less fun, but it was still fun. We had a great team, and, they just kept coming back for it, and, they dealt with anything that we could throw at them. And I think, that sense of achieving this tremendous thing with a group of people is pretty remarkable and never really gets old.
Going to come back to that. I have some questions about 2020, but we'll come back to those in a second. Yeah. So I'm curious. Your first two years were harvest only. Then you got in full time work at Ransom. Tell me about the first full year, seeing what happens the rest of the year as a winemaker, and starting to learn those tasks and roles, and developing your own confidence. You mentioned that kind of developing your own confidence, your own opinions. At what point does that start to kick in?
I mean, I think it's amazing how many things you can pick up early on. I think especially if you are really paying attention and tasting a lot of other wines. I remember going to Tad shortly after my second harvest and saying like, hey, I was tasting through the barrels when I was topping them, and I think this barrel is kind of bready. And he was like, I don't know about that. Like, I don't see why it would be. The pH is not high. It's been sulfured. And I was like, just taste it, and he's like, you're right, it is kind of bready, let's, pull it out and sulfur it some more and all this stuff, and just feeling like, oh man, this is good, like this thing that I was trying to, pull out of the abstraction of tasting different wines, like I've got this thing, and, certainly I think it takes a really long time to feel confident about a broad range of things, and I still, I think they say like the more you know, the more you know that you don't know, and that's certainly true of wine. And in some ways, I think maybe I was more brashly confident, in 2009, 2010 about some stuff than I am now. And when people ask me to explain why I do things, sometimes it's like, I don't know, it just like feels right at this point, I guess. But I think the first full year, I think anybody who makes wine will tell you that the first full year is kind of a shock to the system, because this sort of rush of adrenaline and this sense of a bunch of people getting around and having a big dinner and then going back and working late is just not there anymore. And I think it's something that I try to be really clear with harvest interns about, that it's like, hey, you know how you love this? If you decide to pursue the wine industry full time, know that it is not going to be like this at all. Because quite frankly, I'm not sure that anybody said it to me in quite that clear of terms. And I think that, a lot of the rest of the year, I mean, a lot of it I like even better. I love blending. I love kind of dialing the wines in and finishing them. But I mean, I think most winemakers would say that, there's mountains of compliance paperwork, and this whole thing I said about never wanting a desk job, I sit at my desk a lot, and sometimes that's a struggle, and all jobs have struggles, and I still think mine is one of the greatest that you can have. But I do think that the first year especially, and maybe especially being in that space, I was the only person who was working in production in that space. Tad after harvest had to go back and finish up all that paperwork he'd been putting off, and Di is mostly in the vineyard, and so I think it was like that first year was certainly maybe a little lonely and a little confusing. Wasn't quite sure that was what I wanted to do, and trying to figure it out. But ultimately, I think it was still, you're learning a lot, and you kind of see the process all the way through and understand how these wines, which are so different at harvest, kind of become what they're going to be. And I think after doing it a few times, I think also, you get to a certain point that you have a broader spectrum of responsibilities in the rest of the year, and so it feels a little bit less, like you're doing the same, like, oh great, we're gonna rack more tanks and more barrels, and but yeah, I think certainly that first year was probably, looking back on it, which I honestly haven't in a long time, was probably a hard one.
Did you ever, in that time or at any time, think this wasn't something you wanted to do? Did you ever consider leaving the wine industry?
Oh, all the time, for sure. I mean, I think especially because I had this sense coming into it that I, had made this plan to do something completely different, and I think for a lot, I don't really grapple with that very much anymore. I think now I have a sense that, it makes sense for me to be here, and that I, within the industry there are tons of different things, to do going forward. But ultimately, I think that, the industry feels very much like my home and my place now. But yeah, I think at that time it definitely still felt like there's so many other things that I want to do. And I think the thing that maybe especially us 90s kids didn't get told as much as we should have. There's a lot of kind of like language of you can be anything you want. But I think the thing that I try and remind people who are younger of is that you can be anything, but you can't be everything. And it gets pretty hard pretty fast to like turn the ship, and which isn't to say that it can't be done. I definitely know people who have decided to go to medical school in their 30s, but a lot of especially stuff like that are kind of long-term career training, and I was really aware of that and had a strong sense that a bunch of these things seemed like things that I maybe wanted to do. And I don't know, I'm not sure that I put as much energy into grappling with that as, in a productive way. I didn't do a bunch of informational interviews and try and figure out what were the pluses and minuses of other things. I think I just kind of set myself to the work and eventually kind of felt fulfilled by it. But it certainly, I think anyone who knew me will tell you that I was definitely struggling with that for sure. As I think many people are, but maybe more so coming from kind of the background of being here. And I think whenever you grow up in a small town, there's always this kind of outward pressure, of this idea of like, oh, there's a whole world out there, and maybe you should see some of it or do something somewhere else and not be a quote unquote townie, which I think actually the community has changed enough that while I think most of the people that I grew up with who had really kind of strong career paths planned had this idea that they would do it elsewhere, I think now our community is so much more vibrant, and there are people who choose to come back and settle down, and it seems like there's a lot more going on here than it felt like there was in the 90s and early aughts, which is great because I'm glad to see a bunch of my high school friends doing cool stuff here.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we all kind of like wink at each other like, did you think we'd be like drinking beer at the Oak already? Like I thought we'd go do something else.
Obviously, one of the unique things about Ransom, not just wine there, but distilling and spirits as well. So tell me about learning that part of things as well, and about working with vermouth and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's been a really great thing, and I think it's been great for Ransom as a company to have that flexibility. But I think also it gives you, spirits especially have such a different kind of timeline of production. You're mashing and distilling all the time. It's not like harvest where it's you do it one time in a year, and so I think it's a great opportunity to think about fermentation more often, and to think about enzymes and starch extraction in the mash process. And vermouth, I think especially, has been great because it kind of puts all of these things together. You've got your winemaking and your distilling and the infusion process, and we grow some of the botanicals. So really being able to put together kind of everything for this like really dynamic product, I think has been a tremendous learning experience. And I think vermouth, you have this opportunity to think about flavor in a way that I think winemakers sometimes I taste a wine and think, oh, I just wish that it had a little bit more of a floral character. But in wine, you can't just leave the bag of chamomile in for an extra week and then boom, it's there. And so I think, having this real tool, where the vermouths have this kind of 4-quadrant flavor profile of some bitter herbs and some sweet florals and some kind of like fruit components, and some savory components. And so you really get to build through time and tank this matrix that I think really informs winemaking for me. I can think about the way that something tastes if it's a little bit more bitter and a little bit more sweet, and then that kind of comes back. I mean, it's harder to manipulate those things in wine, but I think still having this kind of palate to practice those sensations and the way that they play is really instructive, and also just really fun. It's fun, I think, to finish harvest and feel completely like you never want to see another grape or maybe even another barrel of wine again, and then go make whiskey in the distillery for a while. And sometimes you wish you could take a break like all the other wine people, some of them do, some of them don't. But yeah, I think doing all three is, I think my brain's always going a million miles a minute, and I think even within the sort of dynamism of the wine industry, it's easy to get bored with stuff, and you can't get bored when you're making every different thing. sometimes to a fault. Sometimes I wish I was a little more bored. Although I'm not really doing so much with the spirits anymore, because Ransom is kind of bifurcated now.
We'll talk about that in a second too, but I'm curious for those of us who have never made vermouth, give us a brief idea of the vermouth making process.
Yeah,
especially coming from a winemaker.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the thing that gets missed a lot in vermouth production is vermouth is a lot better if the wine is good to begin with. So trying to select aromatic whites that have a lot of character, do skin contact on some of them sometimes if need be to develop that a little bit more, but really, just focusing on fermentations that really, affirm the kind of aromatic character of the grapes, and blending different varietals that kind of create these kind of two distinct base palettes for sweet vermouth and dry. So more kind of Muscat, Gewürztraminer for the sweet, more towards kind of Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling for the dry, with some crossover. The sweet especially do a system where we make sure that the barrels are fortified and not topped, at least part of it, for a long time, so you get some of this kind of interesting kind of sherry oxidative character. And then you put together a base blend. If you're doing it right, the base blend should kind of taste like vermouth in and of itself. It shouldn't just be boring old wine that tastes like something that you would just drink out of a bottle, but it also shouldn't be bad or problematically oxidized or flawed in any way. It should be a nice, interesting thing. And then you fortify it with brandy, which we distill at Ransom. So just wine that gets distilled specifically for the brandy process. And preferably that spends a couple of years in barrel first and gets pulled out after that. The sweet vermouth, we also make nocino. We were kind of scratching our heads when we were doing this process of something that we could use that would create this kind of dark caramel color and kind of nutty flavor that wasn't an additive or extract. There's a lot of artificial caramel color in some vermouths and other beverages, and we wanted to do something that we could do that was very kind of like close to the ground. And we had this green walnut tree, so we made a little bit of nocino without the herbs and spices, just kind of green walnuts and brandy and wine. And it's a perfect thing for the vermouth, and it's something that we can do on the farm. So you add that into the sweet, not for the dry, and then take all these botanicals and citrus and so wormwood herb and orange and cardamom and coriander and all these things. It's all on the label. It would be a long list to rattle off, but and then put them in infusion bags and taste over the course of about a month usually. So some of the things I often pull out a little bit earlier if I feel like the extraction is getting strong, or let them go longer if it seems not strong enough. And then it gets super gently filtered and bottled. So it's this process that both takes years and kind of comes together pretty quickly once you're on the infusion process.
Interesting.
And it's definitely a feast for the senses. I think my tasting notes sort of tend a little bit more esoteric than even most winemakers, which are pretty esoteric to begin with, because I'm always like, oh, this is like cinchona root. Nobody knows what that is, but it is.
How did you develop that part of your palate? Is this purely through tasting over the years, or how have you developed a palate that you can describe wines in those kind of terms, and how have you sort of educated yourself over the years on that?
I mean, I think I spend a lot of time, if I'm out in the woods or in the supermarket, I smell and taste everything that I think won't kill me to put in my mouth. And I think, being really intentional about it, not just kind of like giving something a quick sniff, but, really spending time and closing your eyes and trying to sort of imprint those aromas onto your brain. And I grew up and still live on the edge of, the like Oregon coastal forest. And I think that there is a lot out there that is definitely kind of informing the wines. I think a great example that I love to refer to is that I would always do these blending tastings with Patrick and Ryan over at Dominio when I was working there. And Patrick and I, one time, we were tasting a Sturmer Pinot Noir, and so we had 15 or 20 tasting notes for each thing, and then we would kind of read each of our tasting notes and kind of compare and talk about where we thought it should go in the blend. And this one barrel, I had written all the normal stuff, cherries and violets and this, that, and the other, and the underside of a bracken fern, which I thought was really specific. And I was like, I don't think this is not something that like anybody's gonna have a reference for, but like it's very much like the thing that I am getting on the nose of this wine. And I just feel like I should write it down because it will help me remember the wine and kind of like be informed by the wine going forward. And it turned out that Patrick had also written the underside of a fern, which I think both speaks to how much that time that we both spend kind of like wandering around, idly smelling things. But I think it also speaks to the sense of like, that there is this like real terroir driven character, to these wines, and that maybe some of these things that I'm not even certain sometimes if I'm, pulling out of my imagination, that there is kind of a real consanguinity, like in well-made wines, between the wine and the place, even as specifically as the underside of a fern. But the only way that you will be able to pull that tasting note out is if you have walked through the woods smelling the underside of a fern, which I encourage everyone to do. A, because it will, bring a real moment of joy into your life to be out there absorbing all these smells, and because it makes your tasting notes a lot more interesting.
You'll know what it means when you see that in the tasting notes. You'll be able to, I know that.
Totally, yeah. And I think it is, it's helpful, from a winemaking perspective. I think, there are tasting notes for different reasons. There are tasting notes that you're writing to sell wine, to create a picture of the wine that is both honest, but hopefully also attractive and evocative to consumers. And I usually don't put the underside of a bracken fern on those because I think it just sounds kind of snooty and nobody knows what that is. But then there are also the tasting notes that you kind of write to cement a wine and what it is in your own mind. And I think those, the more out there you can get, the better of a sense of the wine that you'll have, and I definitely encourage people, even if it's like, oh, it smells like the foyer of my grandmother's house in the fall, that doesn't mean anything to anyone else, but it informs your connection to the wine, and you remember that, and everyone has that that memory that's super specific to them, but also really profoundly tied to a sense of self or a sense of place. And those are great wine tasting notes, unless you're trying to sell it, in which case you probably better stick with like cherries and violets.
Things that sound appetizing.
Exactly, yeah.
So you mentioned that you were kind of an outlier earlier, and that you've sort of had a role that has grown with you, but that you've basically kept for all this time. But of course, we're here at Duck Pond today, which has not been mentioned yet. So tell me about how we came to be at Duck Pond today.
Well, it was as much of a surprise to me as it was to anyone else. I think, so Duck Pond was acquired by Integrated Beverage Group in 2018. They first acquired Stone Wolf in Oregon in 2017, and they acquired Ransom in the spring of 2020. And it was an interesting time for them to acquire Ransom, both because I think literally the day that the sale went through was the day that the first COVID case in Yamhill County was announced. And so, Tad, I think, goes down in history as the sort of the luckiest business deal, ever, I think, because ultimately, I think this company has made really, good decisions and has come through the pandemic, in a pretty strong way. And also I think just has a broader reach, I think Ransom, has been really focused nationally and through distribution, and has been really heavily on-premise focused. And I think the Ransom brand, I think certainly, being a super small business, I think would have had a much more challenging year on its own, and I think is probably in a better and safer position. Tad probably has a lot less gray hair than he would have had he, had to navigate this small business, where he wore almost every hat that there was on his own. And so I think, it was a big surprise to me, but I think also we were at an interesting point at Ransom where we had been on this, quite literally exponential growth curve for several years. And I think, at some point Tad had kind of said, okay, you know what, this is big enough. This is a sustainable size that we can do with a small team, and we're making products that we're really proud of, that have a good connection to the market. And, let's do these things. Let's do them really well. Let's not stay until 9 o'clock at night waxing and labeling Old Tom Gin because the truck is coming in the morning anymore. Let's try and hit a stride and a sense of, kind of emotional sustainability. And I think in a way that sort of coincided with, I think we had all been doing it for a long time, and I think hitting that stride for me in a way kind of felt like, okay, well, how am I going to continue to grow? It's like I want to be here doing this, I want to be doing what I'm doing, but I also, at some point, if you're doing the same amount of the same thing, I think there can be a sense that, well, what is going to be the next big challenge, And I was kind of mulling that over, as I always am, and failing to make decisions about how to restructure my life, as I always am. And then the sale was announced, and I think it was a big surprise to me, and I think to everyone, because Ransom and Tad have always kind of been synonymous. And I think, for his sake, to be able to just hand it off part and parcel and not try and figure out how to slowly piece out the zillion things that he was owning to different people is probably an easier thing. And I think that he found a really good partner in Integrated Beverage, because they were looking to do a lot of the sustainability work that we had been doing, and they had a broader reach distribution wise, and really I think had the ability to kind of take Ransom and not really change it, but sort of fold it into a broader structure that wasn't just a few people trying to do so many different things, to be able to say, okay, the marketing department will do the marketing, and the accounting department will do the accounting. And so I think as much as it was a big surprise, and I wasn't totally at first kind of certain about, it's like, well, what does this mean for me? How am I going to do this? And also, I think also just, the idea that this kind of big outside company, I was like, well, clearly I wouldn't still be able to make the wines at Lumos and make the wines here. You know, they're not going to let me do that. I mean, it's crazy that even Tad and Di were able to figure that out for, you know, for all this time. And so, you know, that felt really uncomfortable, the idea that I would have to leave, leave Lumos, which I, you know, really love too. And somehow it seemed like I think this company, even though they're, you know, fairly big and fairly geographically disparate, they, you know, they do really kind of listen to people, and they were like, oh no, you know, if you feel like you can handle it, you know, you're an adult, like make it work, you know. You know, and sometimes it's like, am I making it work? I don't know if I'm making it work. I don't know if I've ever really been making it work. But, you know, I think from that sort of initial sense of being taken aback and not being sure, like, you know, how it was going to unfold, I think it's been great to be in this kind of bigger context and doing kind of management of a kind of broader scale of production, and, you know, seeing how to make a 50,000 case wine, which is not something I'd ever really done before, and you know, working with a bigger team, and, you know, being able to hand off some of the stuff that ate up a lot of my time, like ordering packaging. You know, here there's a person who does that, and that is great. Because I think every winemaker will tell you that you can spend a lot of time just ordering glass. So yeah, I think it's been great to kind of see a different side of the industry, and kind of experience different challenges and kind of stay fresh and feel like I'd never really had a job that required me to get on conference calls with people, you know, and I think there's been a lot of professional skill building that I don't think I really realized like how much I needed, and I definitely, you know, have this whole other sort of like linguistic taxonomy, you know, around interacting with these like disparate parts of the company who, you know, have their own skill sets and their own contributions, and, you know, it can be a little hectic. You know, there's always a lot going on. There's always, you know, there's always something being bottled, which means there's always 10,000 things to juggle. But it's a great team, and I think every single person who works here, from the CEO to, you know, the cellar hands, you know, everybody is really great, and it's just been a real joy to, you know, have a new team.
You mentioned that you've been sort of juggling making wine in different places this whole time. I'm curious, as those places both grew, how you did manage that, and how, if at all, that has changed since the transition last year.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely sometimes been a challenge, I think, especially during harvest. I feel like every harvest I get to the end and I think like, wow, I can't believe that worked. I should probably figure that out. But, you know, I mean, it's hard because I started doing them both together, and I care so much about both brands and you know, the people associated with both brands. And, you know, I think it's been instructive to kind of look at what Di does with, you know, running Lumos and managing Temperance Hill and managing several other vineyards, and see that, you know, the real key is to have a great team in place and to trust them, you know. And sometimes I certainly feel guilty, like, oh man, I wish I, you know, was here to do your long day with you, and also, you know, these guys' long day with them. But, you know, the winemaking decisions have been laid out, and we have a plan, and I'm gonna go make a plan at the other place, and then if I can get done before midnight, I'll come back and, you know, help you guys scrub the floors. But I think, you know, in some ways, as somebody who perhaps could be more organized, both in their personal life and their professional life, I think, you know, it definitely, I think, forces me, you know, I go to Lumos in the morning during harvest, and I just know that I need to assess every tank and get everything work ordered out, and, you know, spend whatever time that I have left doing production. But, you know, I think it forces me to, you know, be concise in my, you know, in my strategic thought in a way that is pretty unnaturally to me, and I think probably to a lot of winemakers. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, you know, I am proud of the work that I've done at both places, and, you know, sometimes it feels like a lot to manage, but I think also they have really informed each other over the years too. And I think, you know, the team dynamic at the two places has always been different, and, you know, the product lines, while similar in some ways, have been different. And, the way that I've sort of interacted with my sort of role, in the winemaking team has been different. And so I think ultimately it's been, when you ask me on most days, I say like, oh yeah, it's been great. It's been, because I think most people have this sense of working a similar number of places, but just sequentially instead of, contemporaneously. And I think in some ways that is, probably the better way to manage it in terms of your own sanity. But I do really love that I have this like long history with several different brands, that, I'm not old enough to have been on the winemaking team for 15 years, 2 different places, other than having done it this way. And I do think that you understand site specificity, and the evolution of, farming practices and how they impact the wines and things like that really differently when when you're somewhere for a long time. And I feel really grateful that people have been willing to, work around me sometimes not being there for a thing that that needed to happen in order to have had that experience.
So tell me about your winemaking philosophy or winemaking style, and sort of what you've sort of brought from other people and what you've made your own, and how it's evolved over the years. What are the wines you're trying to make? What are they like, and why?
I mean, I think, as somebody who's definitely, a creature of the place, my main hope is to express the place. And I think, all winemakers say that, and everyone goes about it a little bit differently. But I think for me, the most important thing, I guess, philosophically, is to kind of create this sense of, you have a sense of, what the place has to offer, and you try and think of what winemaking techniques are going to bring that out. And I think a lot of that does become a sense of like, okay, what experiences did I have with the block last year? This one seems like it always has this like really nice silkiness and salinity. I'm going to lean into that by trying to not be very extractive and do some post-maceration, and put it in barrels that are leaning this direction instead of that direction. But I think ultimately having a sense of kind of curiosity about what the place has to offer. I try, if I have several fermenters from a block, I try and do different things with them. Maybe one of them I'll include some whole cluster, and the other one I will 100% destem. And so, the idea is that if I'm building this kind of palette of things, that when it comes time to paint the wine, I'll have tools. And maybe in some years one thing works really well and the other thing doesn't. In some years they both work well, but neither quite feels like the place, and some combination of both does. So I think that's really, I try to be sort of inquisitive about what the site has to offer, and the more different things I can do, I will. If I can do some of them indigenous ferments and maybe inoculate a few with something that I think will be really specific to the character, or have one of them be a shorter fermentation and one of them be longer, one be cooler, one be warmer. It's maybe more work to think about, but ultimately it makes blending really fun. And I think especially, I don't tend to use a whole lot of new oak, and so really, hopefully there is enough there that to kind of structurally build a wine that is, that is complete. And
You mentioned that, especially at Lumos, of course, Dai is known for vineyard, his vineyard and all the vineyards. What along the way have you picked up about vineyard work and about what you are looking for in a particular vineyard, and what you want to express from a vineyard?
Yeah, I think it's been really fun to work with Dai on these wines, kind of as he's been farming in temperance for over 20 years, and I also work with a lot of fruit from our family vineyard, and my dad and uncle have been farming for I guess, close to 50 years really. And so it's interesting to sort of have this reciprocity between site and wine, and I think especially Dai and I do a lot of tasting together of these block designates, and before they're blended and after they're blended, and And I feel like the process of making those wines has really kind of, reflected back onto the farming process. You think, oh man, why is it, Pump House is on Witzel, which is a really challenging soil type, and Dye switched part of the walk over to Scott Henry because it just seemed like the balance wasn't there, and it wasn't necessarily obvious from looking at the vines, but you tasted the wine relative to a block right next to it, and you had this really strong sense that that something wasn't quite, it's like a beautiful wine, but it's just not quite harmonious. And I think through a lot of those tasting sessions, he was able to really dial in the farming. And I think farming is definitely, it's the art of paying attention to one place for a really long time. And I think that my hope is that growers are paying attention and farming sustainably. Both my family farm and all the Lumos sites are farmed certified organic, and I think there are a lot of different ways to move towards sustainability, and depending on what scale you're at, certain things might or might not be viable for different scales and different wines. Here we have a range of things, but I certainly think that the best farmers are really paying attention to their site and being thoughtful about what it has to offer.
So we talked earlier about 2020, and I want to come back to it a little bit because obviously a big year for you in a lot of ways, interesting year.
It was a really interesting year,
So other than the sale, tell me about, as the pandemic gets here, tell me about sort of your initial reaction to it, both personally, professionally, and then the adjustments made throughout the year as a reaction to it.
I think that the pandemic certainly was, through the year, I think, we all felt a lot of anxiety, I think initially, especially, for Ransom and Lumos both being, pretty small businesses at the outset, although Ransom, was in this like big moment of transition. I think like my first concern was, what is this going to mean for the industry as a whole? It seems like as soon as tasting rooms started shutting down, there was this big kind of, a lot of grapes suddenly seemed to not have homes, and it was unclear what the sales channels were going to look like for all but the sort of like grocery store facing SKUs of larger brands, which like I definitely was grateful to suddenly be in a company that has a number of really successful iterations of that. I think those were the things that were really like kind of bright spots. But actually, I think it pretty quickly became clear that it was going to be kind of transformational from a sales aspect. And I think Lumos is really fortunate to have this incredibly beautiful former dude ranch out near Philomath, and it's a space where there's a lot of outdoor space for people to spread out. And so once they were able to reopen, I think it was a real kind of customer base building experience for Lumos, and the tasting room actually had its best summer ever, and we went from feeling like, oh my gosh, how is this going to work, people can't even come out and and pick up wines, to feeling like there was a strong way forward, and that it ultimately would inspire people who might otherwise have gone to a bar downtown to, it's like, well, you can't do that, but what you can do is come out here and set your picnic blanket way far away from anyone else, and be in a place that isn't your living room / bedroom / Zoom office all at once. And I think from the perspective of the seller, it's always, we're always bottling here, and so the challenge of, how do you have a rotating cast of characters on the bottling line and a bunch of people in production, and knowing that you can't stop, and so trying to figure out how to be careful enough to not have a COVID outbreak, because especially during harvest. And I think that actually during harvest, our COVID strategizing ended up informing our production management in a way that was really positive. COVID aside, we organized interns into these 3-person pods and kind of had them doing discrete tasks and moving around together. The idea being that if somebody did catch COVID, that we would be able to isolate the pod until they could get tested instead of all of the interns. And ultimately, I think that worked really well. I think people, ended up developing really strong camaraderie, and it's easier to manage people in a way because you had the sense of like, okay, like what is this group of three doing? Not like, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And so I think that that's actually, even though I don't foresee COVID as being quite as at the forefront of our mind during this harvest as it was during last harvest, I think that we'll probably retain a lot of the things that we did. I mean, I guess I am hopeful that we can also sit at a big table and have a big lunch together, and be able to feel like if we all go out for a beer after the end of a long day, that it isn't potentially going to create, like a contagion event. And not feel so worried, for especially vulnerable friends and family. I mean, it was certainly something that I was concerned about. It's like my parents are older, and I was the person in my household who was going to work in the sort of biggest group of people, and you always think it's like I don't want to be the person who gets anybody sick. I don't want to get sick myself, but I really don't want to get the people that I care about sick. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a tremendous sense of relief now with vaccines. I mean, I think COVID is clearly not over, but it does feel a little bit less terrifying knowing that at least, almost everybody on our staff is vaccinated, and in my family, everybody's vaccinated except for the little kids who, it seems like generally do okay. So, but yeah, I mean, it was a huge learning experience, and clearly the most tremendous irony of all of this is that we spent all summer going to webinars and planning and strategizing about this, this one catastrophe, only to be completely surprised at the 11th hour by an unrelated catastrophe. So, I mean, I guess that just goes to show that, that's just how life goes, right?
Best laid plans.
The best laid plans, yeah.
Well, as long as we're talking about it, let's talk about harvest last year. Again, sort of initial reaction and adjustments you had to make and decisions you had to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first reaction was to just start crying a lot, and I think, initially I think there was obviously this kind of period of momentary confusion where we knew there had been these fires. It seemed like the smoke had been high up. Now the smoke was low down, but maybe it was low down and diffuse enough that it wouldn't be impactful, and there was no way to get numbers from anybody. And so I think we spent the first week of it in a little bit of a daze, knowing that we were probably going to have problems, but not being exactly sure what that meant. And then we did a lot of discussion. I think as we started to watch a lot of people pulling out of contracts, I think my primary concern was that, it's like, okay, now I work for this big company. I'm watching a lot of big companies, renegotiate or back out of contracts completely. Like, I just hope that I don't have to call my own father and and die and tell them like, sorry, we're not buying any grapes this year, because I would probably quit. And fortunately that that was not what this company did. We certainly had conversations, especially we have some vineyards that were in very close proximity to very large fires, and in some cases, we, did some price adjustment to kind of split the, the cost of mitigation measures. But ultimately, everyone, if they wanted to take insurance, there were a few growers that had insurance that preferred to take it. But, I didn't have to call anybody and tell them we're not buying your grapes, and I'm really grateful for that, because I don't think I have the desire nor the strength to do it. And then we kind of just got to work. I had worked with a very small amount of smoke affected fruit one or two times in the past, but 100 cases of something. And not very smoke affected, so I didn't really have a good frame of reference. Like many people here, I think anybody who hasn't spent a lot of time in California is probably flying blind a little bit. And so we just started, getting to work, and we, we have a lab that we use that's kind of associated with our company that was able to do a lot of testing once they kind of got online, and it was great to be able to do trials and see some actual numbers that suggested like, okay, yes, like these press fractions that we're making, the fact that every time a press load of Pinot Gris comes in, it has to go into 4 separate tanks instead of 1, and that means 4 times as much work at every stage of the process. That is a pain, but it is working. You can see here that there's way more of these compounds in T4 than T1. And so, I think we learned a lot. Ultimately, as I was watching a lot of people, kind of saying like, we're not going to do it, we're not even going to try, I was kind of having the feeling of, I think I'm sometimes too optimistic about things, and I definitely laid awake some nights thinking, what do these people know that I don't? Like maybe this is all going to be for naught, and we will have worked incredibly hard for no result. But we have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, certainly at least tens of thousands of cases of 2020 Pinot Noir on the market already, and it seems like people are drinking it. It's gone, and we're bottling more. So, I think through a lot of hard work, I feel like we have made a lot of wines that we're proud of, and it's definitely not something that I want to do again, but climate change is real, and so I'm sure we will do it again. Hopefully not. I think the scale of having basically the entire Willamette Valley affected to some extent, I think hopefully is historic, and it wouldn't be quite so bad if it was a little bit here and a little bit there. I think just dealing with everything all at once is really challenging, but I feel like we learned a lot, and I'm definitely more prepared for the next time, which I just hope it's not this year. If we can just get one year, and then next year, maybe, I don't know. It's going to be a thing, and it's good that we all learned a lot about how to deal with it.
Yeah, you need a bounce back year, right? You gotta have a bounce back year before.
Totally. Like 2007 was so hard, and then in 2008 it was this nice spaced out harvest. We harvested in t-shirts, and it's good because if 2008 had been like 2007, we might not be sitting here talking right now. And I joke about that sometimes with friends in the industry, like, how many years like 2020 do you think you could do before you left? It's like, maybe not very much. Not in a row, at least. But I do think it's like a tremendous testament to the passion of the industry. In California, they have had significant challenges in some areas, not the entire state, but certainly there have been wineries in California that would have been dealing with it at the scale that we're dealing with it 3 years running. And I, have tremendous admiration for their fortitude. And I hope by the time it gets that bad here, I'm retired. But unfortunately, I'm pretty young, so I probably won't be.
Maybe living in British Columbia or something at that point. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. Or maybe we'll get our act together as a society and turn the tide.
You're very optimistic. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's like you kind of have to be. I think winemakers have to be optimists. You have to be a time optimist at the very least. You have to believe you can do more than is possible. You have to not be able to think about time in a realistic way.
You mentioned something earlier about that kind of the changes some of the changes in the industry you'd seen in terms of sort of accessibility and realistic accessibility. From a more broader perspective, what else has changed in Oregon wine? What are the biggest differences from your kind of early impressions of it to now? And what do you see as you look ahead for the future and for the industry?
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, especially in the last 5 years, the sort of entrance of, bigger companies and, players from elsewhere, at scale. Obviously, we've had a lot of pretty significant acquisitions, perhaps the least of which Ransom. I think, the number of acquisitions over the last few years, the landscape of the industry has really changed. I guess one thing that I see as potentially, diminished sort of suite of accessibility is accessibility to contracted fruit. I think historically the way that, a winery has started in Oregon is somebody, somebody scrappy and passionate purchases some contracted fruit and builds a program and builds it into a bigger thing, and then maybe at some point plants estate vineyards, and then kind of grows it from there. And I think that as you see a lot of the sort of traditionally accessible, couple tons here, couple tons here, there, properties, at the ultra premium level, especially, be sort of, held in house by purveyors. I think in some ways, I think those are really exciting opportunities for those vineyards to get global recognition. But it's sad in a way, because I think that, in order for people to really not just kind of start something, but start something that is, able to achieve international recognition, there needs to be that access without having to have millions and millions of dollars to plant something and wait. And it's one of the things that I love about working with temperance is I think, it is one of the vineyards that's still really doing that for people, and still allowing small brands to have a piece of something really remarkable. And I think it's been an important thing for a lot of brands as they grow up. And, a lot of the folks who are not working with temperance anymore kind of built their estate program and then kind of returned it to, the next generation, of kind of up and coming brands. And I think it's great. It's great for the industry to have resources like that. And I definitely see that as something that has diminished in the last 10 years. And I hope that it won't diminish completely. But I think also it seems like every year it becomes kind of more challenging to source fruit if sourcing fruit is your kind of like primary MO. And I think that if you are a business trying to protect your own interests, it really does make sense to, own your properties, and then you can farm them how you want, and, and have guaranteed access. So I think especially as we see more really significant, interests from California and France and elsewhere coming in, they would be foolish not to do that. But I do think it really changes the ways into the industry. And I think just as there are more, the likelihood of somebody getting an entry-level full-time job that has a clear upward trajectory within the company, I think is much greater. Even when I always, joke around with friends who, are in kind of similar generational spot to me. It's like, yeah, like kids these days, they don't know how lucky they are to have a full-time cellar hand job and not have to just cobble it together from 5 different places, 5 hours a week, and it makes us feel very old. But it's true. I mean, there are more kind of opportunities that are meaningful. But I think the flip side of that is that, perhaps a lot of the entrepreneurial spirit that, the Tads of the world, where it's kind of like you're working as a cellar hand and doing all this other stuff on the side, I think maybe it's, it's a different set of opportunities, less access to fruit, less sort of kind of cobble it together mentality, and more opportunities to kind of, function as an employee within a brand and have kind of stable, career opportunities that way. So, I think it seems like a more mature industry, and I definitely think that there are reasons to be nostalgic for the way it was and reasons to celebrate the way that it is. And I think that right now in a lot of ways feels like a little bit of a sweet spot, and that it's getting to the point where it's pretty hard to imagine anybody who is not independently wealthy or heavily invested in purchasing land, especially this year post-COVID. Somehow it seems like it has gotten way worse, which was not what I expected to see happening. But I do think that, especially relative to California or France, I mean, in theory, it's still somewhat possible here, and I guess it seems like that won't be true for very much longer. And I think that's definitely, something to mourn. And I think it's a challenge for us in a policy way. I think the land use rules that kind of protect farmland, I think are really important. But it is an interesting thing to think, okay, I think 15 acres for a winery seems like the right size in order to have kind of, enough space for wastewater and, to have meaningful acreage. But also now it means that, the cost of buying a 20-acre property and planting it suddenly means that, nobody is going to do that without significant wealth anymore in a way that you could in my parents' generation or even, the generation between us. And so I think it does become, it's a challenge for the industry, I guess, and for society in general to figure out how do we create opportunities for equity and make sure that the land doesn't all become sort of the provenance of large corporate interests and like extremely, wealthy folks from elsewhere. Like, how do we make sure that somebody can still kind of work their way into having something? And I do not know the answer to that question, but I'm interested in what other people have to say about it.
Are there other challenges that you're looking ahead for? Anything else that kind of on the horizon that alarms you, or that you're looking forward to? Is there something coming for Future of Oregon Wine that you're excited about or fearful of?
I mean, I'm excited about a lot of things, and I think that we have, there are a bunch of, now that Oregon has this reputation that's globally known for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, I think there is a lot of movement into other varietals, which is certainly exciting as somebody who likes to drink different stuff and make different stuff. I think the thing that I am the most fearful of, and I think anybody who's paying attention should be, is water. We have a very dry summer season. It gets drier for longer every year. Most Oregon vineyards are, either dry farmed or, if they're on a smaller scale, at least, probably most is not, because the big guys have meaningful irrigation systems set up, but, there are a lot of places that have relied on being able to dry farm, and I think historically that has been, I would say the right way to do it and a sustainable way to do it, but, you can't dry farm if it never rains from April to October. And we're not there yet, but there have been years where it's been close, and I think ultimately what does not work is for everyone to tap into residential wells in groundwater limited areas to water vineyards, and a lot of years that's what ends up happening. And I know the Eola Hills can't handle it, and there doesn't seem to be a plan. And I think that all of these hillsides are on small gravel aquifers. I think the water situation is critical, and I don't think there are enough answers. And saying this out loud, I'm realizing that I need to be better about investing my own efforts in figuring it out. But it's tough, because nobody wants to be limited, and nobody wants to not water their flowers. And honestly, the scale of the problem is probably such that even if nobody showered all summer, we would still have a problem. And I think ultimately it will take really meaningful, thoughtful programming and lots of kind of permacultural structures and things like that to figure it out. And as usual, we will probably start thinking about it as soon as it's a couple of years too late and has already been a really critical issue, because we're humans, and we bat the ball that's whizzing by our face right now and not the next pitch, and that is what it is. But yeah, I think water is the thing that we all need to think a lot more about. Not just vineyards and viticultural land and wineries. I think the region as a whole has grown so much, and the fact that there were water use restrictions in a lot of the small towns when I was a little kid, and now those towns have 3 times as many people. I don't know how they're doing it, but yeah, we've got to get together as a community and really figure that out, or the industry, I think, will really suffer.
What about for yourself as you look ahead? What's coming next for you and all of your various projects?
I know. This is what keeps me up at night. I think I certainly am engaged in a lot of things. I think I love doing all the things that I'm doing, and at some point probably I will have to figure out how to prioritize and scale back one or the other. I think especially as I certainly don't spend as much time in the vineyard as I should. I'm sure either of my family members would probably say that too. And I think especially as they get older, like I've got to figure out how to fold that in for a more meaningful way too. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm never totally sure. I mean, I feel really invested in all of the projects that, that I've been working on, and definitely, feel invested in seeing them through, whatever that means. But I also feel like I, have developed really great teams in all the places that I work. And so, maybe what that means somewhere is kind of like handing something off to somebody, but I haven't figured it out yet. And ultimately, I think, right now I still feel like I am learning a ton everywhere, and, trying to figure out how to make it all work. While also, I think a lot of the stuff that we've touched on in terms of, land use and, like water management and things like that, it's been hard, I think, with COVID too, to go to some of those meetings that are in person, but it's definitely something that, that is a real goal of mine, like in the next decade, to try and, be engaged in that discourse, because I do think I have a fairly unique perspective, and, sometimes people listen to me, and I think especially insofar as a lot of the sort of planning around that has to be, has to involve all of the shareholders. I think there's a lot of mistrust between the wine industry and the communities within it, and I think the wine industry has significant culpability in that, as does some of the other folks in the community, and I think bridging those gaps, because I think there are great people in all corners, and we're going to have to work together if we want to figure all this stuff out.
I hesitate to even ask this, but are there any projects on the horizon for you, or anything else you're excited to do?
Gosh, I mean, I think I guess nothing super specific comes to mind, I guess. I mean, I always have lots of projects at my own place, and I think at some point there's definitely more land there that would be cool to plant. I'd love to have some whites there, but I think figuring out how to have enough time to do more of that as is probably is an important precursor to that. And I always have lots of personal. I think my next non-work related project is going to be building the wood-fired oven on our patio. We were going to do it last year, but didn't quite get to it. But the patio is poured, so that's like a good first step. And I don't know. I mean, I think there will always be something, but I don't have necessarily a clear view of, maybe not as clear a view as I should of what the next thing is.
Fair enough. If you had to give advice or words of wisdom to someone who wanted to join the Oregon wine industry, what would you tell them?
I think I would tell them to, if you're working for somebody who, who you feel good about. I mean, I think that, finding mentors who are really positive influences, people who not only challenge you but also really affirm you, and just networking as much as possible. I mean, I think that I have learned as much sitting, outside the Bitter Monk and talking to people who were kind of tangentially related to me within the industry and asking questions of technical reps. I think a lot of my sense of, of understanding kind of the finishing process of wines comes from technical reps, and they are a wealth of knowledge, and it is actually their job to make the case for their products, which often involves a lot of education. And I think just being really intellectually curious about all sorts of things, and reading a lot of articles, and just sort of making sure that I think the thing that I say a lot, which I guess is maybe not direct. I guess I did recently phrase this in the form of direct advice to somebody, which is that the Oregon wine industry, and I think the wine industry in general, has this really kind of, dynamic and, often haphazard organizational structure. I think if you were talking to someone who is, in training to be a physician, there is this clear, then you go to medical school, and then you do your residency, and then you can do a specialty residency, and, and then, these are the things. And I think in the Oregon wine industry, and, this is certainly something that, that I felt in my late 20s and early 30s, and depending on how quickly you find your way to the Oregon wine industry. I think this can happen, at many different points in your life, but kind of at the same point in your professional career, that it isn't always clear, it's a ladder that kind of goes through some pretty obtuse ceilings sometimes. And I think a lot of people end up feeling like the way forward isn't necessarily clear, and the way to the next step isn't necessarily clear. And it's easy to kind of feel like you're sitting in a spot and not really understanding what it means to your ultimate trajectory. And I think that, when you're in that spot, the thing to do is to focus on some specific thing that you can really kind of build within that role. Maybe if you are an enologist, you can set up a big project that moves something forward for the company but also looks really good on a resume. Or if you are a cellar hand who wants to kind of get to the next step, I knew a guy who was looking for a job, Kevin, who's up at Halloran, and he's like, I'm having a hard time finding a job. I'm going to start a wine journal club, and it'll be a great way to network, and I'll be building, my own kind of like keeping my skills sharp and keeping my brain sharp, and also meeting people, and hopefully impressing them with my thoughtful insights about these wine journals. And I think, stuff like that, it's really easy to say, wait, how do I get from point A to point B in the wine industry? It's not nearly as clear. But I think just staying engaged, networking, saying hi to everyone, being personable, and being kind. But I think everyone kind of hits this plateau where it's not clear, what the way forward is. And I think the thing that I would say is that for almost everyone I know who has kind of gotten beyond that, it ends up being a total surprise and not necessarily something that was achieved strategically. Not that it's like, you're working hard, you're doing everything that you can do, but I think a lot of times things in the wine industry happen in these kind of fits and starts. And I think just like having a clear view of that, and of course the problem with things is that so often, if you're being, interviewed for a trade publication, you don't say like, oh yeah, and then I sat around wondering what I was doing with my life for a couple of years, and then suddenly I got a promotion, and then I knew. I think people condense their own stories into things that have, a narrative arc that is logical. And so I guess the advice that I would give people is that it is almost always illogical. Almost everyone has this sort of experience of, oh yeah, and then I was feeling like I'm a winemaker now. Like, why do I feel like I am not sort of relevant? Oh, okay, now I have gotten nominated to be on the Grand Seminar panel. Like that feels like the next thing that allows me to sort of expand my reach and my professional role. And I think the sort of chaotic nature of the wine industry makes sometimes like the path forward really unclear. But I think as long as you're connected to people, working hard, and making sure that you are trying to always like improve and grow your skill set, that something good will happen, but not necessarily when you expect it or because you did a specific thing.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? 2 minutes. Perfect.
2 minutes. All right.
These are all the questions that I had for you. So is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything we didn't cover that we should have covered today?
Gosh, I feel like that was a pretty great run through everything. I mean, I think those were great questions, and I think yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, for hosting us here, and sharing your story with us and your thoughts. And we will go ahead and let you off the hook, and just in the nick of time.